my the connection. Okay. Mostly I have a good connection. On occasion, when the current goes, then I lose the connection, and that may happen. I hope it doesn't happen. If not, bear with me. I'll have to reconnect. But yeah, and I'll speak for about half an hour or so. The connection. Mostly I have a good connection. On occasion, when the current goes, then I lose the connection, and that may it doesn't happen. If not, bear with me. I'll have to reconnect.
I am hearing the recording. Is it on purpose?
Yes, ma'am. We were just checking once at our end.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am. With your permission, shall we begin now?
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Right, ma'am. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Akshat Maini, and I'm currently a research assistant at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. It is a matter of great pleasure to extend a warm and humble welcome to all to another edition of the ICS's Wednesday seminar titled India and China, Some Comparative Thoughts in Relation to Child Marriage. In today's session, the focus will be on exploring the historical backgrounds and contemporary contexts surrounding the phenomenon of child marriage in India and China. Despite sharing comparable histories of 19th century social reform, the two countries have taken divergent paths in the 20th century, shaping distinct dynamics in present-day marriages and family structures. China is notably associated with an imbalanced sex ratio marked by an excess of men and a shortage of women. Conversely, India, while contending with regional disparities in the female population, prominently addresses the persisting issue of child marriage in the 21st century, garnering attention on both national and international agendas. The objective of this presentation are twofold. First, to advocate for a re-evaluation of the term child marriage in India, and proposing more fitting descriptors such as adolescent or early marriage, whether arranged or self-chosen. Second, to highlight the underreported media coverage of underage teenage marriages in specific provinces in China, encouraging a more nuanced and constructive approach to comparative analysis when examining marriage dynamics in both contexts today. The speaker for today's session is Professor Mary E. John, former professor at the Center for Women's Development Studies, New Delhi. She was director of the center from 2006 to 2012, and before that, deputy director of the Women's Studies program at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, from 2001 to 2006. Her major publications include Discrepant Dislocations, Feminism, Theory, and Post-Colonial Histories, reprinted in 2021, A Question of Silence, The Sexual Economies of Modern India, reprinted in 2021 again, and Women's Studies in India, a Reader, published in 2008. The co-edited volume, Women in the Worlds of Labor, Interdisciplinary and Intersectional Perspectives, and the monograph Child Marriage in an International Frame, a Feminist Review from India, were published in 2021. Her areas of interest span the field of women's studies and feminism within the social sciences, with a particular expertise in studies pertaining to marriage and family, education and labor, as well as a more philosophical interest in the concepts and frameworks of feminist theoretical analysis. Today's session will be chaired by Professor Govind Kelkar, who is a feminist scholar with a PhD in the political economy of China. She is a visiting professor, Council for Social Development in Institute for Human Development, India. She is the executive director, Gen Dev Center for Research and Innovation, India, and was a senior advisor, Landesa, Seattle, USA. In concurrent assignments, Professor Kelkar was the International Research Coordinator for Energia International, the Netherlands, and research lead on gender and energy at Swaminathan Research Foundation, Chennai. Her recent book titled Witch Hunts, Culture, Patriarchy and Structural Transformation, and was published by Cambridge University Press in 2020. Before I hand over to the chair, I would like to ask all the participants to follow a few housekeeping rules. All participants will be muted during the presentation. Questions can be posted in the chat box. Please include your name and affiliation when you post the question. Alternatively, you may use the raise your hand option during the interactive session. I shall now hand over to the chair. The floor is yours, ma'am.
Thank you, Akshat. You had done very good job introducing the speaker and introducing me, and thank you for your generous introductions and very comprehensive ones. I just wanted to say the kind of the discussion and the meeting today is very timely from point of view of both China and India. In China, recently they are discussing the topic of the growing bride price and dowries and the associated disputes, including some criminal cases and high rising divorce cases. And there has always have been for some time the issue of kind of getting students, not getting students, but getting, of course, the young people married and have children. So that is probably in view of this kind of background, Professor Mary John's lecture today is very important. I read her book long time ago, and as soon as it was published, so it was not published long time ago, but some time ago, and I was very intrigued, and I agreed with the idea of the compulsory marriage, which was the kind of China's fiat that at that time, right from the liberation period. So thank you very much, Professor Mary John, addressing this issue, and please look forward to hearing you.
Thank you very much, Govind, and to everyone at ICS for sort of cajoling me into making this presentation today. I feel very hesitant about doing so. I am not at all an expert on China, and but at the same time, I have sort of dipped into the history and looked at some of the issues in the context of my concern with the way in which child marriage is now circulating worldwide and in India as an issue. So let me present, and I really look forward to your considered thoughts and questions at the end. In the course of my study of child marriage in India, I encountered many unexpected twists and turns. To begin with, India itself presents us with a very uneven picture. Historically, child marriage is at the very heart of colonial India's story of social reform, from the first campaigns against child widows in the mid-19th century to the intercontinental reverberations and conflicts around the Child Marriage Restraint Act, CMRA, of 1927, that raised minimum ages for girls from 12 to 14 and for boys from 14 to 18 years. The focus on child marriage recedes with independence, and when, as a direct response, openly claiming to aid population control policies, the CMRA is revised post-emergency in 1978 to 18 and 21 years for women and men, respectively, there is not even a ripple by way of a reaction. Child marriage re-emerges in the 21st century via international agencies and state pressure. India has the largest numbers of those who marry before the age of 18 years, 100 million all told, according to the census 2011. This is a quote-unquote harmful practice, using UN terminology, that must be eliminated by policy measures and by law. Not only is there a scaling up in policy efforts to raise the age of marriage, even though recent decades have seen a decline in rates of underage marriage, but the government proposed in 2021, the Indian government, to raise the minimum age of marriage for girls to 21 years in the name of gender equality. The objects and reasons of the new bill, the PCMA 2021, are unusually lengthy and wide-ranging. I do not know of any bill in recent times that has mentioned everything from a woman's physical, mental, and reproductive health to her disadvantages in higher education, in employment opportunities, skill training, and entry into the workforce. These disadvantages, it is rightly said, perpetuate women's dependency on men. Improving maternal mortality, the sex ratio at birth, the nutritional status of mother and child are also matters to be tackled through the proposed bill. The language is that of empowerment, ending discrimination, greater self-reliance, the Sustainable Development Goals, and CEDAW. Equality, the foundation of our institution, will be holistically realized through equality in marriage laws. Elsewhere, I have refuted most of these claims. What India is currently witnessing is that about 23% of young women in the age group 20 to 24 years marry before 18, when they are usually in the age between 15 and 17, that is when they are adolescents and not children. Age at marriage is not the most significant factor affecting their health and well-being and those of their children. It is poverty. Moreover, when it comes to very significant aspects of young women's life chances, such as work and employment, which is so important in any discussion of women's economic dependency, fewer women work at higher ages at marriage in a context already characterized by low and declining rates of labor force participation in recent decades. My greatest fear is that this kind of narrowly legal attempt to forcibly raise the age at marriage would do much more harm than good, bringing large numbers of young people into the zone of being criminalizable, robbing women of the legal protection that marriage can provide. It is this kind of intense and narrow focus on so-called child marriage in contemporary India that prodded me to look at other histories and present-day contexts where gender disparities have been a major focus. With considerable trepidation and anticipation, I therefore looked at the example of China, a country that today is not associated with child marriage in the first place. China presents numerous challenges for any account of its recent history of marriage and gender, especially so when it comes to the theme of early marriage. China's history is amongst the most complex, given the contentious nature of its politics, especially over the course of the 20th century. Some parts of this history are not well known or understood. This is also evident in the cumulative scholarship on Chinese women and issues relating to feminism, which itself is in a constant process of being revised and rethought. So why choose China when early marriage is not a significant topic of study and official statistics from the Chinese government to the UNICEF global database claims that underage marriage does not even exist? My reasons have to do with what we might stand to gain even from a very brief and patchy account. I'm as interested in how the question of early marriage came to be tackled in its reformist and revolutionary history, as in the kinds of approaches that scholars have come to adopt in order to understand the political and intellectual history of the women's question in modern China itself. China is often paired with India, whether in terms of its status as an Asian economic power center or on account of gender issues. As already mentioned, the figure of the child wife in India was a central motive of reform during the colonial period and became highly controversial through nationalist and feminist ferment in relation to imperialist forces of various kinds. The Chinese situation was also deeply conditioned by its version of colonial modernity. The first feminists at the close of the 19th century were men who were responding to the widespread sense of crisis pervading Chinese society from the mid-19th century. Imperialism and capitalism made inroads following the Opium Wars in an intellectual climate crisscrossed by modern ideas of liberalism, anarchism, socialism, and feminism through translations and adaptations of Western writing of all kinds, along with forms of argument and citation practices concerning Chinese texts and traditions of thought. These feminists turned women into the subject of their liberation and of the very freedom of the Chinese nation amidst fears of losing out to the more advanced nations of the West and to Japan. Such writings, which became very popular among a new intellectual class of both women and men in the early decades of the 20th century, set up the West as a kind of model. Europe or the US were often imaged as places where adult men and women could choose each other freely to form happy, healthy families. By contrast, China had a long history of marriage by enslavement and was obsessed with bloodlines and lineages, bride price and dowry, and Chinese women suffered as dependents and were not deemed worthy of education. Race and eugenics through healthy mothers also played a role in these writings. Tani Barlow has provided an extended study on the question of women in Chinese feminism, which explores the trajectories of theorizing on women from the turn of the 20th century and the rise of the Communist Party under Mao from the 1920s, and focuses especially on the writings of a few publicly acclaimed Chinese feminists from the Mao era until the capitalist development agendas of the 1990s. It is during the 1930s that Barlow notes a decisive shift in terminology and orientation of the CCP by grafting local categories onto their international Marxist lexicon. Here, what is most unprecedented is how attention turned from the earlier public figure of the new woman, who came from an intellectual, if not elite class, to that hitherto disregarded non-person, the peasant woman and worker. Woman was identified in the new Chinese Soviets as a political, and I'm quoting, as a political subject who met the following criteria. She was over 14 years of age, had been emancipated from the fetters of child marriage, prostitution, and female slave systems, had recourse from family violence. Her physical body did not bear the marks of feudalism, that is, no earrings or foot binding. This subject existed inside a structured sphere of politics, beyond a rural calendar of fieldwork, and beyond rural social relations. A rudimentary bureaucracy concerned itself with her welfare and ensured her freedom of marriage. Close quote. Child marriage, or rather infant marriage, was a reference to a particular form of marriage called adopt the daughter-in-law or baby-raised wife, whereby families brought up baby girls from another family soon after they were born to become the future wives of their small sons. The ceremony was undertaken many years later. Such so-called small marriages may have been undertaken for reasons of poverty or the shortage of women, and were socially looked down upon compared with the marriages of post-pubertal women. According to Arthur Wolf, this particular practice was not simply a means to cut down on marriage expenses and had little to do with the age of the bride, but by bringing up a compliant future bride in the in-law's own home, was to minimize the conflicts between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law so common in mainstream arranged marriages. It is likely that such marriages declined after the 1960s. For what it is worth, one autobiographical account by a man born in 1966 from a very poor family whose own mother was a baby-raised wife recalled that while his mother did bring up a girl from another poor family as his future bride, he had no feelings for her since she was like a sister to him. When she got a job in a nearby brick factory, she married a fellow worker and his parents did not object. What is significant is that age at marriage was not just an integral part of the larger agenda of the Communist Party around marriage, but developed into a new kind of family politics under the aegis of the state. After the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949, the marriage law of 1950 ruled against arranged and forced marriages, allowed divorce at will, and stipulated 18 and 20 years as the minimum ages of marriages for women and men. Marriage reform itself played itself out in conjunction with major national economic drives and the promotion of women as workers on par with men, often at considerable cost to the personal relationships of these new revolutionary families themselves. There's a growing literature on what changed in successive years in different urban and rural regions of the country. The most challenging and contentious periods of China's political history included experiments in collectivization and the Cultural Revolution that brought the Mao era to an end in the 1970s. In a recent summary of existing scholarship, Gail Hershutter begins by saying that the story of Chinese marriage practices in the 20th century has often been told as a transformation from family-based oppression to limited individual choice, or in another register, from feudalism to socialism, with the PRC's 1950 marriage law making an important, if ultimately incomplete, moment of progress. Every piece of this story has been called into question by recent scholarship, close quote. And yet, for all the many kinds of nuance that her rich synthesis brings out, much of this story is actually not fundamentally undermined. Certainly, rural areas have turned out to be much more opaque regarding the kind of changes that could and did take place, including resistances and unexpected consequences in attempting to implement the new marriage law. It is the era after Mao, the so-called market socialism of the 1980s, and the further reforms and heightened patterns of capitalist development since then that have seen many more critical reflections from feminist perspectives, highlighting signs of growing gender inequality and even complex reversals regarding family structures in a context of undoubtedly unprecedented wealth creation and reductions in poverty. There is hardly any discussion of changing patterns in age at marriage in the literature on marriage and family in China, and what little there is has reported positive developments. The 1980 revisions in the marriage law raised minimum ages of marriage to 22 for men and 20 years for women and made registration compulsory. Hershutter cites statistical studies to show that already by the 1930s, only 10% of married women in urban areas were under 15. In rural China, Although there were 8 million new marriages of women under 15 in 1990, these dropped to half 4 years later. Other studies demonstrated that there is now greater autonomy in mate selection, which was a big problem after the 1950s, with parents continuing to play a central role, and that the state enforcement of minimum ages at marriage has contributed to the greater acceptability of cohabiting before marriage, even if open talk of sex and pleasure may incur social disapproval. If there is one topic that cannot be avoided, even though the Chinese state took its time to acknowledge it, it is the gender imbalance in sex ratios at birth, widely seen to have been an unintended consequence of the one-child policy to curb population growth from 1979. This revealed son preference and missing girls in large proportions in several regions, significant enough to affect the child sex ratios of the country as a whole. Adverse sex ratios, including its social consequences, is a theme that has seen some comparison between India and China. A strong marriage squeeze operates against men in China, more so than in India, with the exception of states like Haryana and Punjab, and will only increase as more children from the one-child policy generation come of marriageable age. Some predictions suggest that while women will gain in the marriage market by migrating to wealthier areas to maximize their chances of upward mobility through better employment and marriage prospects, significant numbers of men from poorer areas in particular will find themselves unable to find a spouse. These are China's leftover men, who are said to pose a policy challenge to the Chinese state in both the long term and short term. In such a situation, there have been quite a few critical reports of an unexpected phenomenon, that of leftover women. Leftover women, a term with negative connotations like leftover stale food, was coined by the Women's Federation in 2007 to refer to women older than 27 years who are single. According to a study by Letta Horn-Fincher, this has resulted in an aggressive and even sensationalist state-led media campaign against such women and increased social pressure for marriage. On the one hand, it is not clear why any special reasons need to be advocated as to why some women do not wish to marry. In any case, a highly segmented marriage market by class and education will work against even those women who do wish to marry according to conventional rules of hypergamy, that is, marrying up, if they enjoy relatively better levels of economic and cultural capital than most men in their circle. On the other hand, analysts like Fincher believe that there is more to this phenomenon than what meets the eye. Women are losing out in China's real estate market at the time of their marriage, because even when they have contributed substantially to buying a home, in most cases, the home is registered only in the name of the husband. The most recent changes in marriage law in 2011, however, stipulate that upon divorce, property be divided according to what has been registered in each spouse's name, unless the couple agrees otherwise. Fincher believes that women are, in fact, being goaded into marriage under hugely gender unequal circumstances in order to escape the fear and stigma of being quote-unquote leftover. Whether or not Fincher's specific arguments are valid, there may well be considerable social pressure on women towards marriage and having a child in contemporary China. Under such circumstances, it is hardly surprising that little or no attention is being paid to present-day early marriages among young men and women. Only small tentative signs are to be found in the news. One is a photo essay with pictures of several teenage couples, where one of the youngest pictures is of a girl of 13, each with their baby, living in villages in Yunnan province. And this particular news essay was by Isabel Hunter and Mui Xiao. The short commentary also quotes from unnamed sociologists to paint the following picture. Underage marriages are quite common in rural China, it is said, and the family registers the marriage after they have come of age. Owing to the gender imbalance, there is a hurry to get married, especially among boys who do not wish to wait for their parents to arrange one. In several villages where jobs are found to be only in distant locations and cities, there is little to do, and young teenagers in love drop out of school, especially when the girl gets pregnant. Such young people may be staying with parents on whom they are financially dependent, or stay with grandparents who look after the small children while the young couple migrates for work. In another short essay on the subject, the journalist Mui Xiao has the following very interesting quotation from a sociology professor. I'm quoting, "The whole area has long had a tradition of getting married early. So for the teenagers and their families, there's no social condemnation involved in doing so, says Liu Ning, a professor of sociology at Peking University. China is an aging society, he goes on to say, and birth rates are relatively low even in rural areas. So people are enthusiastic about procreating, especially when it can increase a village's population of adults and stem the hollowing out that takes place when young adults leave home to seek work in the cities. The end of the one-child policy also signals the dawn of a new era of encouraging childbirth. To a certain degree, the decline in marriage age is a reflection of national policy changes and not something to be blamed on culture. Close quote. Another short essay using statistics titled How Serious is Early Marriage in China by Li Yuan shows significant numbers of married men who are married below the legal age of 22 years, 16.6 underage marriages among men in all first marriages in the year 2010, and women who have married below the age of 20, that is 11%. Most of these marriages happen just below the respective legal ages of marriage. In rural areas, the figures are higher, they're 25% for men and 17% for women. Certain provinces stand apart with very large numbers. Statistics provided on younger ages are much lower, just over 1% of 17-year-olds and less than 1% of 17-year-old boys, which is probably why it is easy to disregard such figures internationally, where 18 years is taken as the standard minimum age for considering marriage as legally viable. Even so, at least one government source on statistics of men and women in China does acknowledge early marriage among adolescents in the age group of 15 to 19 years. In the absence of any academic discussion and follow-up, it is not possible to dwell too closely on these exact numbers and information, although they should not be discounted. If indeed most underage marriages are not registered until the couple has reached the legal age, then the statistical figures in any case may well be underestimates. As the comment by Professor Liu Ning indicates, there may even be a positive spin on these developments. In any event, the Chinese state is more concerned about other social matters of governance. It has become an aging population since 2000, is troubled by rising divorce rates, and has relaxed its one-child policy since 2016. The purpose of bringing China into existing discussions on child marriage in India is to seek out appropriate comparative perspectives on marriage and early marriage. Superficially, the very large numbers of early marriages in India would seem to belie the meaningfulness of such comparisons. But we should keep in mind that in China, their rural populations are in minority, whereas we continue to have the majority in our villages. Hence, local context might well raise interesting comparative questions. As already mentioned, China's priorities appear to lie elsewhere. It is currently pushing to make marriage for women more compulsory than it is, including pressure to have a child, resulting in a policy of limited pronatalism as a part of its strategy of population stabilization. On other accounts, women appear to be discriminated at the workplace and made to retire at earlier ages, if not encouraged to become housewives and consumers more than producers. Feminist scholars in China and abroad are concerned about China's care economy in this area. Here, the emphasis is mainly on women's unpaid care work, including greater burdens on rural grandmothers when migrant couples leave their children behind, and on the vulnerabilities and needs of the elderly themselves, a situation that is exacerbated for the one-child policy generation. Early marriage among adolescents in poor districts falls between the cracks, can be seen as a non-issue, or even be given positive meaning on the rare occasion that anyone takes an interest in the matter. In this paper, I'm trying to set up a discussion from the Indian context in relation to China, a country that does not come to mind in relation to this problem. Early marriage was widespread and unremarkable in China until it became a matter of explicit reform in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, not unlike India. Today, teenagers in China are marrying in local contexts and among social groups that are variously identified as poor, rural, disadvantaged, or ethnic minorities with little by way of choices. Their numbers are statistically small on a national scale, although, as we have seen, underreporting cannot be ruled out. Rather than dwell on the numbers, we ought to consider that the persistence of practices that push the very young to marry in contexts such as these can be of comparative value to third world nations like India. India's marriage market is still highly structured by arranged marriages within highly segmented marriage markets, so much so that so-called love marriages are an exception, though the numbers are growing. India's poorest and backward regions see significant numbers of families marrying their daughters before they are of minimum legal age as a strategy to deal with the social, economic, and safety costs of leaving them unmarried. These are not children, as may have been true in the past, but adolescents. Their middle-class counterparts in urban context negotiate a highly unequal marriage market replete with massive dowries and big fat weddings as legal adults, but often with little by way of subsequent economic independence. Instead, these often highly educated adults are expected to provide the best for their future families and in the bringing up of the next generation of children. Among the very small numbers of women who choose their life partners in India are teenagers in both urban and rural India, who may have to elope when they fall in love with a quote-unquote wrong boy, sometimes with tragic and violent results. Compulsory marriage structures shape the life chances of almost everyone in a country like ours. China offers glimpses of a situation that is volatile and bears its own similarities and differences. Yes, there is pressure to marry and a stigmatization of women who wish to remain single. Yes, there is pressure to have a child, and quite unlike India, this is favored by the state. Not enough is known about the Chinese situation. How much support do young people have? Are there marriages that invite hostile, if not violent, reactions? The biggest difference, as I see it, is that whatever the gender discriminations in China and its care economy, marriage in China is no longer the kind of fundamental institution that it is in India. More than ever before, for women in 21st century India, marriage is compulsory and overburdened with multiple meanings: social, sexual, reproductive, and especially economic. So much so that while small numbers may contemplate making their own choices, the vast majority would still rather leave it to an intergenerational contract. Only minuscule numbers can actually consider a meaningful and economically viable life outside marriage. We should not be in the least surprised that under such conditions, there will be those where parents or the young people themselves engage with this compulsory institution sooner rather than later. If these are the trends that show no signs of going away, what further comparative lessons may we draw from the little that we know of gender and its disadvantaged teenagers in contemporary China? Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mary. I think we would now like the chair to step in here. Govind, can you unmute yourself and or is her frame frozen? I can't make out. Is she still online? Can somebody give her a call to see whether her connection is...
We're just checking, ma'am.
Well, okay. So just briefly to fill in space till she comes back. So yeah, I mean, what an amazing, she's here. Govind, can you, I was just trying to step in for you. I think there's some problem with her connection. The image is frozen. Hmm? Yeah.
Ma'am, we're asking ma'am to reconnect.
Yeah, okay. She is back now. I can see her movement. Yes, Govind, please take over. You're muted.
So this was of the time that probably I would come later that participate in discussions. I mean, ask questions and comments. So it's open to the participants. Can you hear me?
Yes, it was a bit patchy, your connection, I think, because it wasn't coming
Can
in.
you hear me?
Yeah, you can. You are audible. So yeah, I think what you were saying is that you're opening it up for participants to join in the discussion.
No.
We weren't too sure as to what was being said by you. So maybe if you could repeat.
You were asking me to do that?
You the chair, so I thought you would step in now. Now that Mary's talk is over, and
No, I am requesting Mary to say concluding lines, Mary. That's what I have said. But it is important that what you concluded on. We did not hear anything.
I see. So anyway, we had heard it, but Mary, maybe just for the benefit of those who didn't, if you could just repeat
Govind,
your.
did you lose me towards the end? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, yes, for about
Oh, okay. And is that true of everyone, or was that did others hear the paper to its end? Or?
didn't hear anything.
Okay.
I was hearing everything. I don't know about the others. That's why I said maybe it was patchy in places, but
well, no, actually, I was just trying to throw up questions for thinking together from our context. Our context being one which I call compulsory marriage, where it's near universal, where arranged marriages continue to structure the marriage market, ranging from marriages being contracted at earlier ages in order to overcome the social, economic, sexual, and so on disadvantages of waiting. So on the one hand, we have a market where families arrange marriages early in an attempt to manage this market, compared to those in urban areas and across different social and economic groups who marry as quote unquote adults into markets that are highly structured by dowry and expensive and other kinds of considerations. So within which a very small minority are making their own choices, but they remain a very small minority in the Indian context, and an almost minuscule, completely exceptional group are in a position to not marry. So that I was just trying to quickly set in place our picture within which we have the phenomenon of early, what I call early marriage or adolescent marriage rather than child marriage, from which to look at the Chinese situation where child marriage is not an issue for anyone. It's just these tiny little articles that I found, which however paint a very fascinating picture of rural life and of teenagers who then marry and make a life together. Have to have, often the woman is pregnant and so on, about which we then have only these very, very kind of, passing kind of comments without the benefit of any detailed kind of studies to give us a better account, but appearing to be okay. Society is okay with it. The state doesn't mind. The state has bigger problems on its hands and so on. So I found this very fascinating, that here we are with a quote unquote big problem, and over there it's not a problem.
Well, thank you, Professor Mary Joan. I mean, that is what was very important in terms of when you are looking at China and India. So Indian part, toward the end, I did not hear, and that's why I requested you to speak. What I found is very fascinating, because I have been also very much intrigued and interested in China's marriage law soon after the liberation. And one of the important things, as you rightly pointed out, China has really arranged and have taken off the idea of compulsory marriage. Self-arranged marriage was questioned. Parental role and that hierarchy relationship, they were kind of done away with. And along with that, there was also this going out policy. It was not called at that time going out policy. It was kind of said that women have to work outside home. And that changed the situation, that it was no longer they met, they chose their partners. While in India, we are just kind of raising the age at marriage, but we are not looking this way or that way. We think that only by passing the law we can really deal with the kind of age of marriage. India, of course, doesn't face the problem of aging population. They are 45% or little more. Our population is young. So that is the reason we have to wait for 20 years onwards, and then we see what would be the nature of the policy. China is facing this problem. They are recently very kind of, even in this Confucian situation which has come up as part of their civilizational structuring of the society, is really thinking that marriage is important, but children are more important than marriage. So that the children are important because now they want children as the producer. So that is has become one kind of important thing. So children outside marriage also would be welcome. The recent kind of, these are the situations that are emerging in China. In Indian situation, you have very well pointed out that if we look at the history of our from freedom struggle, or even earlier, which you have pointed out very rightfully, we did not go into that debate on the somehow soon after kind of this became a concern that when children got married, there was a kind of oppression of those children, which was, of course, in China also. There was a kind of adoption of the brides, the child brides that was there. But Indian situation was on a similar line, but at the same time different. So this kind of analysis is very, very important. We should be doing in other areas also. That would be very important. So it is very good feminist lens on the whole history of China and India, only with regard to the women's rights, and with policy also. It is a very good reflection on the policy, that if you look at the very narrowly, that you are going to introduce something and make it effective, looking at that kind of particular thing and not looking at this side or that side, is external kind of areas, then probably these policies are not going to be effective, whether they are with the women's rights or they are with the rights of the other marginalized people in the society, which is, or even including poverty reduction. So how much our work participation rate indicates that what is there and how women are being treated. So with this kind of bit of introduction, I would ask really request the participant that no question is unimportant. No question, every question is important. So please feel free to ask Professor John that what the questions that you have not understood, or you disagree with, or you would like more clarity on this. Please go ahead. Akshat, you can help in terms of raising this thing. I see there are 2 questions on the chat. You can either read them or you can ask the participant to read them.
Thank you so much, ma'am. We've got a question from Mr. Imran Akhtar from Afghanistan. He states that cultural norms and customs play an important role in perpetuating child marriages. In India, child marriage is associated with poverty, gender inequality, and the dowry system. Has the Indian government done anything about these issues so far?
Should I answer questions one by one, or?
I think so. This is from
Okay.
Afghanistan. Maybe
Yeah.
he's asking 3 questions into one.
Yes. Okay, how should we think about let me use it. I can't speak for Afghanistan, though I think the rates in Afghanistan are less than in India. I first of all, I use the phrase early marriage rather than child marriage. Children, I think of as, below puberty, and I would want us to stop thinking in those ways about what is happening today. These are teenagers. These are young people who are, either by a family or on their own engaging in a relationship or marriage. So first, I would say let's describe it better. rather than to use a language of child marriage, which was the language of the 19th century. Also maybe we should engage with the international language that insists that anyone below the age of 18 is a child in a kind of hard and fast fashion. I think we need to have a much more graded sense of that. And now, as I mentioned, the Indian government wants to redefine a child as anyone below the age of 21 when it comes to marriage. And I would say we need to engage with this. I don't think this kind of hard and fast definition of a child who therefore is entirely in a situation of vulnerability and in need of protection from the law, has no agency whatsoever. That's what the definition of the child does. I think we should re-engage with that. Secondly, you say that it's very much cultural norms and customs. Yes, of course, culture is absolutely central, but I think culture is in turn something that is dynamic. You know, when we say cultural norms, we have in mind something, we tend to think of static traditional ideas that don't change. Whereas when it comes to marriage, marriage is very much in flux, something that is undergoing profound transformations or resistance to change. I mean, it's a complex combination of factors that are in fact involved in how marriages happen. And in the Indian context, at least, I can say that what is happening to marriage practices is very much a product of what is happening in a range of spaces, including education and including employment. And the fact that India, along with certain South Asian countries, is probably one of the only spaces in the world where arranged marriages, intergenerational decisions regarding marriage, it continues to be the major structuring of marriage, is not simply a cultural norm in a simplistic sense. It's not simply a carryover of a traditional practice. I believe it is being reproduced and strengthened even by changes elsewhere. So on the one hand, you have a great deal of expansion when it comes to education. And on the other, you have contraction or very limited options for women when it comes to work. And in that context, when women cannot find future economic independence via, employment opportunities, and this is across ages, whether you're a, wealthy or not so wealthy person, when that is the case, then marriage occupies a huge economically central role and its presence is not simply one of, say, regulating sexuality in a simple sense of respectability and so on. So I think that we therefore are in a situation in India which is quite complex. And the reasons why marriage remains compulsory needs to be understood. And within that, my argument in my own writing is that underage marriage, early marriages are a response to this compulsory structure on the part of those who are vulnerable. Those who are vulnerable have to engage with this institution sooner rather than later. They cannot afford to wait. Whereas a marriage market for the rich and middle classes may dictate waiting till their 20s. A poor family with limited access to education, to other opportunities, will want to marry off their daughters at an early enough age, such that they feel that they have, settled their daughters. So I think we need analysis of that sort to fill out, otherwise be simply a cultural norm in a static way. What is the government doing? As I think Professor Kelkar mentioned, that our government is focusing far too narrowly on simply delaying the age, providing, certain schemes, but more problematic schemes are okay. There are schemes that, reward a family if the child remains in school up to a certain age. There are even schemes that give you a certain lump sum. They're called dowry schemes. They give you a lump sum if a woman is 18 and only marries at the age of 18. These are called Dahej or dowry schemes, which is quite a joke, actually. In various states, there are these schemes. But more problematically, what the government is doing is to try and make the law is to strengthen the law. That is to say, to make it more easy to criminalize families, especially the boy's family or those who are involved in conducting the marriage. They can be criminalized. And that is, to my mind, an extremely dangerous idea. and an extremely dangerous. And of course, as you can imagine, it's who gets criminalized, not the families who arrange marriages, but young people who elope.
Yeah.
And then the parents of the girl put a case against the boy. These are the cases that we see in the courts. And then the boy is put in jail, the girl is put in a shelter home, and it's a very, very I mean, the only thing I can say is that if there was violence coming their way, the girl is maybe saved from that kind of violence. But otherwise, it's an extremely unsatisfactory way of dealing with this practice. Maybe I'm sticking my neck out here, but I do feel so.
I think you are absolutely right.
Ma'am, there are no other questions as yet. However, I do have a question of I think we've
Sure.
just received one more question from Dr. Rajiv Ranjan.
Yes.
I'll just read it out real quick. Ma'am, he congratulates you on your wonderful presentation. And he says that you said that child marriage or underage marriage in China is not much of a problem for either society or the state. I hope I heard you right. Although many young get married, but then they find themselves surrounded with many problems. For example, they cannot get marriage certificate and so cannot buy property. And children born out of such wedlock are not legally entitled to get IDs, which is one stop for all Chinese benefits and citizenship. We have seen many kids have to wait until their parents get the certificate. So in a way, is it punishing or discouraging early marriage? He asked for your comments.
No, excellent. I'm very grateful for this because I don't know if this is information you have from the field or your own, maybe your own research. I'm relying on the little bit of information that I could find from the news. I have seen absolutely no research on the subject. And it is the way in which the nature of the commentary was such that I then, and the fact that that if something is a problem, then you expect there to be attention being given to it. You expect to hear about states, actions on it. And I have not found. So if there's anything you are aware of there, I'd be very happy if you would put me in touch with that. And the kind of comments that I mentioned in my paper where, in fact, these are, in fact, even academics who are being asked their views and who present a rather benign picture saying, yes, it is happening. First of all, they acknowledge that it is happening. It is very much happening in certain districts amongst poorer young people who drop out of school, who have nothing much else to do. And according to these comments, it is sort of dealt with locally. There's a waiting period when precisely given what you're saying about the certificate being so important. And this, I think, is a gray area very much so. According to the what I read, they try and keep it hidden until such time as they can, register the marriage. That's what I heard, but I can absolutely imagine what you're saying, which is what happens otherwise. That is to say, well, how do such families cope? What if registration is so significant and children are being born? What happens to them if they can't gain any kind of official certificate to put them into the system? Surely there will be impediments. Surely there will be problems. But all I'm saying is that those did not emerge such as they are. It was more like an understanding, coping somehow with that. And even according to one commentator, one professor, that this was being welcomed because they're living in a time of aging populations, too few children being born. So if teenagers are bringing children into the world, so be it. This was the trend of what I heard, and what you're suggesting is that it's not as easy as all that, and that the acceptance and problems that such families, and I'm sure they are, and it would be very important to hear more about what the struggles are of such young people in the context in which they find themselves. And these would be young people who are poorer, who have fewer choices, who may have to travel long distance to find work, who leave their children maybe with their own parents, and so on. Hardly a very happy situation, I'm sure. So thank you for your comments and question.
Ma'am, we've got one more question from Dr. Ritu Agarwal. She asks, do you think education was an important factor in delaying marriages in urban China? What about rural China? And what about remarriages?
Okay. I don't know about remarriages, so you may have to help me out here. And yes, I can well imagine that those contexts, as is true in India as well, it's not accidental that most of our early marriages take place in rural contexts with limited access to education, or where even after high school, a young woman in India, maybe 16 years old, finishes high school, has doesn't have much else to do, nowhere else to go, and the family then thinks that this is the time to marry her off. So you may even have a high school, you may have even gone through high school, and yet find yourselves in a situation of early marriage. So it is in the Indian context, it is only with college education that the phenomenon disappears. And of course, there's a whole different marriage market when it comes to that level of education. And it's not necessarily education. Again, I want to say for the Indian story, it's not that education means more independence. In India, the education degrees, very complex, very highly educated, sometimes professional degrees, have a very strong link with marriage markets, with who your spouse will be, what kind of groom you will have, and it does not simply translate into greater employment chances in any simple way. So that's the Indian. In China, I imagine that urban context, yes, it would be practically non-existent or invisible in contexts where education beyond schooling and so on is much more common. And I would say not simply, and I would also not only place the burden on education. I would say that employment opportunities are such. To me, would be a more interesting contrast to make with India, that young people in China do not imagine getting married as soon as school is over. They imagine working in some capacity or the other, whatever the nature of the work may be, whether well-paying or not. They can imagine a future in the employment market side by side with or apart from marriage. And that is the contrast with India. In India, we have very few options of meaningful employment after education. And therefore, marriage becomes the single most important. That's why I call it a compulsory marriage situation for almost everyone. Whereas in China, that is not the case.
Thank you so much, ma'am. We request the audience to please raise their hands if they wish to ask questions. Alternatively, they can also post their questions in the chat box.
Yes, please go ahead. In the meantime, I can ask a question. Is that okay? I wanted to know really, institution of marriage is an influx in both India and China. That is important to recognize. India women's movement has played a very big role in terms of looking at the dowry murders, that where the family became an institution to be criticized kind of thing.
Yes.
And China, so long the most period was there, or Marxist period was there, probably the so-called the socialist kind of socialism was there. Women's dependency, both economic and emotional, was really being questioned. But after Confucianism, which talks like Manu and three obediences to father, husband, and the son, and that is implicit in the Confucian ideology, which is promoted very much in the present day China. So, and both men and women are revolting against it. They are rebelling. I mean, there is a kind of the men who, young people who are questioning this, and they want to get married on their own, in terms of not so much own, but from away from family shackles. And that is the trend, particularly in urban areas. Even in rural areas where the workers come to work in the factories. I mean, rural people come to work in the factories, and then this happens. They mingle, they get married on their own. Of course, this is unlike China, unlike India. In China, where self-arranged marriages or the so-called love marriages are not kind of looked down upon still. I mean, how many honor killings are there? We can look at even Delhi, I mean, the state of Haryana, which is very closer kind of thing, that Khap Panchayat and others, what they have been doing, issuing things like fatwas that they cannot have mobile phones, young girls cannot have mobile phones because they might be chatting with boyfriends. So this is a fundamental difference also when the Imran Akhtar talked about the culture. There is a kind of question of the cultural system playing very kind of repressive role, more repressive role in India than in China. Thank you. What is your view on this, Mary?
No, I agree with you. I broadly agree with you that there was something very, very basic. I mean, of course, I'm not a Chinese expert, but I do believe that the fact that marriage reform and the new revolutionary family was so tied up with a whole range of changes in women's lives, in family lives, in working lives. That is what made it meaningful, and that's what made the changes happen as they did. Where are we? People now say that in these decades, there's been a loss of ground on many of these in contemporary China, that there's increasing discrimination against women. Women are being pushed back into the home, much growing pressure to marry, and so on. But I do believe that this history has made a difference, and that our history has not had that. Our history has had pockets of revolutionary thinking about marriage, and so on, but not enough to make the institution itself transform. So instead, we have a much more passive process of educational expansion, of of men's employment markets and their demands on a marriage partner, making demands on marriage. So the marriage market is going through tremendous changes in India. Ages at marriage are higher in urban and middle class contexts. High levels of professionalism are there, but I don't see that it has not been accompanied by enough thinking, and even I would say from the side of the women's movement, the point you raised, that once we did have campaigns against dowry. Once we did, this was in the 70s and early 80s, and those campaigns ran aground. So today, for instance, dowry is normal. There is no issue around it. It may be legally on the books that you can't take dowry, demand for dowry is illegal. We have a law in the books, but it's a dead law. It has no, in fact, rates are through the roof. And women themselves, young women themselves, want dowries in the absence of inheritance and other kinds of rights. For them, it's security. They don't want dowryless marriages. So we are seeing an accommodation in India around very problematic practices that are reproducing and expanding themselves in the current moment, more than sort of running out as old-fashioned. They are in fact actually expanding. And to my mind, yes, I think that women's movement has maybe not done enough to make this institution of marriage a focus, as distinct from, say, incidents of domestic violence and so on, which obviously must be a focus. But what is the institution of marriage itself, and how much it is actually playing its part in maintaining dependency for women in India as a matter of rule, and for the majority, for those who marry as adults, not just for those who marry below a certain age. I think that is the heart of the matter in our context, which we are not, which only occasionally we talk about, and most of the time we don't. So I agree with you completely that the Chinese story is distinctively different, and therefore they are on a different footing, even when they're tackling many of the things that they're tackling at this point in time.
Thank you, Mary. Yeah.
Ma'am, we have an observation from Dr. Agarwal. She says that early marriages are considered to be important for maintaining family harmony at any point of time. Women's Federation has taken up this issue of marriages in China, especially the idea of a happy family. Any comments, ma'am? Thank you.
Okay, I'm not sure I fully understood the. Is it a question? The question is that have early marriages been considered important in order to maintain family harmony? Well, historically, early marriages were the norm everywhere. I mean, let's be clear that it is only with modernity that across the world, and let us include Europe and let us include the US, let us include everyone, that marrying Romeo and Juliet were 13 years old or whatever. You know, I'm saying that early marriages were not even considered anything to comment on. Marriages happened because the kind of modern notions of becoming an adult, earning a living, work, the conjugal couple, these are all much later developments in history. So first of all, we should recognize this, that it's not accidental that child marriage becomes a matter of great reform and in the 19th and 20th century, and not before. It is a marker of modernity that these are then issues across the world. And I mean, as China and India are the examples here, but this is not unique to these spaces alone. So it's not so much about harmony. It's about, this is the structure. This is the understanding of age is a very different one earlier in time, and our understanding today of development and so on, or what is an adult. These are newer ideas that we are now grappling with and that are part of contemporary capitalist societies and its demands on the workforce to be educated and all of those things, right? So that's the only way I think of it. It's not so much about the harmony question. I think I raised it in the context of the so-called baby-raised wife, which was I found very, very fascinating in China, which was a particular kind of marriage practice, you could say, where a family, and these were usually poor families who also probably want to avoid dowry and other kinds of payments. A poor family would, after a boy is born, with a very small boy, would adopt a girl from another family and bring up that girl in this family to become the future wife of the boy, of the small child. So this practice existed. It no longer exists as far as I know. It existed, and yes, it existed at that time in the name of the girl. And this again is interesting, that an older daughter-in-law coming into the household would be seen as a source of tension. Mother-in-law, daughter-in-law, again, a very common theme of tension in a context of great inequality between women, where the daughter-in-law is now meant to take her place within the household and take on a whole set of duties. Mother-in-law is now in a situation of some power over the daughter-in-law. That this was apparently a source of considerable tension in China, and this was considered not very favored, but was one way in which families sought to overcome by making the daughter-in-law part of the household, as it were, by having her grow up in the same household and then marry the boy that she grew up with. And this system existed to some degree, to what extent I cannot say, and broke down. It no longer could, and it no longer exists. It broke down.
Practice, yeah.
So I don't know if I've answered your question.
The family harmony, the happy family, these are the kind of various points All China Women's Federation has off and on kind of suggested. Yes. But not early marriage. It was only the marriage. Early marriage was not kind of their attention. So women's kind of duty within the family, domestication of the women and doing the double work. So the care work would be very, very important. And it still continues. The party has continued with double work for women, double or 3 times of work, that they have to be good kind of party workers. They have, so that is one kind of thing. And then they have to do, of course, engage in production activities, and they have to do all household work also. So avoid conflict at any point. That was women's responsibility. So that is, and of course, feminist analysis in China, that very much. But All China Women's Federation, of course, was considered a bit of traditional institutions, although it changed its character when they heavily argued for the ending the one-child policy, what it was doing, and government listened to them for change. I mean, when they were changing the policies. So. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Govind.
So are there any other questions and insights?
Ma'am, we do not have any other questions in the chat box right now. However, if the audience wishes to make any last questions, You can please raise your hands or use the chat box.
Audience seem to be very polite, Mary, huh?
Yeah.
So,
I
thank you.
think there are no other questions.
We can conclude then, Akshat. And thank you very much, Professor Mary John. It was really a very big effort to kind of take historically this aspect. And I think we need more research both in India and China on this question, rather than a lot of NGOs, including, are working on the child marriages. And you have questioned the whole concept of child marriage, because a 17-year-old is or 18-year-old now is not a child. And of course, you remain child till you are 21. This is a joke. So that is the one of the things that probably we need to reconceptualize the whole aspect of the child marriages. And then probably, and the policymakers should also learn from this analysis. I think they need to learn from the academics and researchers. That is my strong belief. And also activists. They also come with new ideas. But seems like policymakers don't have the time to think about these things. Some kind of cliches come and then they make laws on this, and that happens. So with these words, I would like to conclude. And Akshat, you should have the last word since you introduced the thing.
Thank you so much, ma'am. With your permission, shall we conclude the session?
Thank you.
Right. With this, we shall wrap today's session. We thank Professor John and Professor Kelkar for gracing today's session with their presence and for giving us their precious time. The video of today's discussion shall be available on the ICSS YouTube channel. We would also like to invite you to next week's seminar titled Contested Geopolitics of Reincarnation, Tibet, and China. The ICS conducts seminars every Wednesday, and further information regarding the topics can be found on the ICS website. You may also subscribe to our newsletter for regular updates. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.